Tired of doing investment research on stock markets? Wants to go for a walk outside the house with a friend? Introducing iCapital, where you can get investment advice on the go. It is accessible via app and website. Subscribe now to iCapital for stock news. iCapital is reliable because they thoroughly research listed companies, economies, and stock markets. iCapital provides a clear perspective of how markets interact and how it influences your investment. When investors and traders are debating whether to buy or sell their stocks, fret not, as iCapital will recommend Malaysian and global stocks. iCapital is available on Apple App Store, Google Play Store, and Huawei App Gallery.
Hi, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Teng Boo from Capital Dynamics again. And before I dive into this week's topic, I'd just like to remind you all out there, please do not fall for the scams of the people who are impersonating me. I still get this very frequently, and it's coming from all over the place. I've already said many times that I don't use WhatsApp, and I only use WeChat because it's so much more reliable than WhatsApp. So please tell other people, share with other people this almost very persistent impersonation of Teng Boo, Capital Dynamics, and iCapital. So, okay, this week we are talking about America's possible descent into a civil war, right? It's not just something that is a theoretical possibility. I think there are many people out there, many serious people out there who are worried and concerned that America is heading towards that direction. The famous hedge fund manager Ray Dalio, I think recently said that there is a 35 to 40% chance that America will enter a civil war. So if somebody were to come to you and say that, Malaysia or Singapore or Australia or Philippines has a 30 to 40% chance of a civil war, I'm sure you get worried, right? But in this case, it is different. We're talking about the largest economy in the world, the most powerful country in the world, which has got the most nuclear weapons in the world, the most number of aircraft carriers in the world, descending into a civil war. That's serious. That is very, very serious. Okay, now why are we saying all this? Let me just share with you what President Biden said recently.
When people are saying, but Mr. President, I'm feeling, my buck isn't going as far. What do you say to those folks about the economy and what's going on?
Well, I say we have the best economy in the world. We got to make it better. We really do have the best economy in the world.
Here you go, President Biden saying that they have the best economy in the world. Now, that is an American politician, whether it's a president or whatever it is. What do the ordinary Americans think? What are they experiencing? This year, there were 2 polls taken by Harris on behalf of the Guardian newspaper from UK. This was very recent, and the results of the 2 surveys were in complete contrast to what President Biden said. So either Biden doesn't really know what is happening to his own country, or the ordinary Americans are totally ignorant of what is happening to their own country. You take your pick. Because these 2 surveys found persistent pessimism among the ordinary Americans about their own country. 55% of Americans think that the US economy is shrinking, and 56% think that America is already in a recession. Yeah, 49% of the Americans, this was the second poll, think that the S&P 500, the New York stock market, is down, that it has been declining. 49% of Americans, again from the same polls, believe that US unemployment rate is at a 50-year high. Now, 58% of those who surveyed say that the American economy is worsening because of mismanagement from the Biden administration. This probably could be true. And 72% of Americans surveyed think that US inflation is worsening. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the US economic condition, US economic statistics, and what is happening to the US stock market, you may think that, well, these ordinary Americans don't really know the facts because US economy, the GDP, has been expanding for the last 2-3 years. In fact, the first quarter, US GDP was still expanding. And the S&P 500, the NASDAQ index, composite index, was recently at all-time high. And unemployment rate, US unemployment rate at about 3, it depends on which month, at about 3.7, 3.8%, is at a 50-year low. So now, why is there this great divergence? And US inflation has dropped from a peak of about 8-9% recently to about 3.5 to 4%. But yet, this survey, the two surveys, are giving us completely different signals. Now, this divergence is worrying, because this is an election year for the US presidency. And when the ordinary people feel and think differently, very differently from the politicians and the US president, there could be some dire consequences. Let's take a look at another index. This is the Russell 2000 index. This is the most widely used index for stocks with small capitalization. Now, the S&P, the NASDAQ rally is probably based on a very narrow base, the NVIDIA and so on. And this Russell 2000 is based on 2,000 small caps. Now, small cap is not in absolute terms, it's in relative terms. And based on this, the Russell 2000, I can understand why the ordinary Americans feel that the stock market is down. Because it is not at all-time high. It was recently at all-time high in 2021, about 2005, and plunged to 1,006 about 12 to 18 months later, and still hasn't really recovered all the losses. So the Russell 2000 index is most likely reflecting the experience faced by the ordinary Americans who have not gained from the narrow rally of the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ composite. So if that is what the ordinary Americans are feeling, what does that mean? Before that, let's take a look at another startling statistic. This is from Edelman. Edelman is a global communications company, and every year, for the last 24 years, they've been publishing what is known as the Edelman Trust Barometer across 28 countries and coming from 32,000 respondents. So these are the countries you can see below. These are the 28 countries. Let's look at the result. Let's compare the two most important countries in the world, China and US. Now, the overall index, the index covers 4 components. Trust in NGOs, in their own country NGOs, trust in the businesses in their own countries, trust in their own country's government, and trust in their own media, right? In the case of China, the overall trust index was 79% versus only 46% in United States. There's a huge gap. Take a look at each component. In terms of trust in their own businesses, 81% of the Chinese people trust their own business. Only 53% of Americans trust their own American businesses, their own corporations. Now, this is a about 30 percentage points gap. That is unbelievable. One is supposedly a liberal democracy, capitalist country, one is supposed to be a socialist economy. Next. What about trust in their own NGOs? The same divergence. China 72%, America 52%. The next one is even more startling. This is the one that I think explains a lot. 80% of the Chinese people trust the Chinese government. Only 40% of the Americans trust their own American government. Remember earlier we shared with you what Biden says? We have the best economy in the world, and then more than half of the Americans think that the US economy is in the recession. So what you're seeing in the Edelman Trust Barometer confirms this divergence in what the ordinary Americans feel and experience versus what the politicians in America are saying and doing. What about the next item? Media. 77% of the Chinese people trust their own media. Only 39% of ordinary Americans trust their own media. So, if I say don't trust the Washington Post, the New York Times, and so on and so forth, I'm not the only one. 39% of Americans don't trust their own media. So if you look at across the four major pillars, media, NGO, government, and business, you find that America is a society, is an economy that is very divided, that is very fractured. Divided in the sense that what the ordinary people and what the politicians are saying, there's a huge gap. And not only that, among the Republicans and the Democrats, there's a huge gap. Among different levels of society, different components of the economy, there are major fractures, major gaps. So now the question is, if Americans don't trust their own government, their own businesses, their own NGOs, and their own media, why should we in the rest of the world trust them? Now, the important issue for today is not about the rest of the world. The important issue for today is, will this divergence, will these fault lines in the American society lead to a civil war in the United States? Let's take a look at some facts which most of you know, but if you put them together, they form a very potent combination of a civil war breaking out. We know that America has the world's highest rate of gun ownership among civilians, right? The whole country has about 400 million firearms in private American hands. This is not the US Armed Forces. This is like people like you and me having guns, having all kinds of guns. And the ratio is about 120 firearms per 100 person. That means one person has got more than one firearms, right? So America has got only 5%, less than 5% of the world's population. But the Americans, the ordinary Americans, have 40% of the world's privately owned firearms. This is more than enough to form a second army in the United States. This can form what worries a lot of political scientists and observers in America is that America can have militant groups, armed militant groups. The civil war that they fear, that people are worried about, would not be exactly the same as the first civil war. The circumstances are different, the landscape is different, and what you can see would be potentially where, because you got so many private citizens in America that are armed, so these people can form militant groups, armed militant groups, in all over the United States. And United States is a big country, and these armed militant groups may form without even the FBI or the NSA knowing. So what I'm saying is that if you put all this together, the ingredients are there. Let's take a look at some scary photos. This is a lady and a guy. You look at the firearms that they have. I don't know. I mean, I can't recognize some of them, but they look very powerful. And this is just a young couple. The next one is from this lady. You can see the guns. This is her garage at the bottom, in front of the garage, on the floor of the garage. You can see there are, there's so many pistols. There are so many. Maybe I can't tell because there's so many of them. And this is only one lady. Next. This is really shocking. This is a family with 2 kids. I haven't taken the trouble to count the number of arms that they have. I think they probably have more than maybe a sizable police station in Malaysia. And many of them look scary. And these arms are displayed so easily in front of very young children. Next. This is another family, 2 young child. The father, I presume, his dad is in Alabama. And you look at the number of guns that he's showing you. And, these are private homes. And if the person does not display in his compound like that, you wouldn't know that this person has got something like maybe 60, 70 weapons in his house. And that's just one person. So these are the armed people, and they can form militant groups, and a civil war can break out because you get so many armed militant groups committing violence. That's one point, the gun ownership. Barbara Walter is an American political scientist. What is interesting about her is that she is one of the world's leading experts on civil wars, domestic terrorism. And she's got good credentials, not just academic. In 2017, Barbara Walter joined the CIA task force aimed at predicting civil wars outside America, at predicting civil wars all over the world, in your Nicaragua, in Latin America, in Middle East, and so on and so forth. Now, she wrote a book called How Civil Wars Start. This was written in 2022, and she was talking about her own country. She says that she's very used to analyzing conditions, environment in foreign countries that are ready, that are close to having a civil war breaking out. So she used the same type of analysis and applied to her own country, United States. And her conclusion was scary. You can read the book yourself. And she says that America, if it is not already in a civil war, it is close to having a civil war breaking out. There are few factors that she identified: the Trump's presidency and his refusal to accept the 2020 election results, which the crisis is still ongoing now, right? This is already 4 years later, and you're looking at the 2024 presidential election. And the other factor that she has identified is the erosion of American democracy. So this is coming from an expert who is used to analyzing conditions in foreign countries where they are ripe for civil wars. She applied it into her own country and she gets a very worrying condition. But she says that, not just her, but many political scientists say that the civil war that they foresee will not be like the one that broke out a few hundred years ago. Nevertheless, it is still going to be a civil war in a country which is the largest economy in the world and the most powerful military country in the world. So, what we know now is, coming to June, right, 31st May, Biden and Trump are in a very tight race for the 2024 presidential election. Based on, depending on which survey, which polls you're looking at, the support for both candidates is about 50-50. It's even when there's a difference, the difference is very, very minor. So it's a very close race, right? Next. And just yesterday, Donald Trump was found guilty of 34 felony counts on falsifying business records in his Manhattan criminal trial. Right? Now, does that mean that he cannot run for presidency? No. The US Constitution has got only 3 conditions for a person to be a presidential candidate. You must be above 35 years old, which obviously he is. You must have been a resident in America for 14 years, of which he has, and be a natural-born citizen of the United States, which he is. So he's qualified, all the 3 factors, which means that even though he's a convicted felon, Donald Trump is not prevented from continuing to campaign for the US presidency. And what happens if he wins? Or, that is not so scary. What happens if he loses, like 2020, but he is convinced that he won? He is convinced that there was electoral fraud, like in 2020. You know what happened on 6th of January, right, where the US Capitol was invaded by a bunch, quite a big crowd of his supporters who were having guns and so on and so forth. So I showed you earlier the divergence between what the ordinary Americans are experiencing and feeling and what the president and the American politicians are saying and doing on one hand. On the other hand, you have hundreds of millions of private Americans who got a lot of weapons. And then you have this leader, this political leader who I think no one really knows how to describe him. Right? No one really knows how to predict his behavior. So if he wins, let's say, by a convincing margin, probably the chances, the risk of a civil war in America would drop drastically, because I think Biden is probably too senile to go and fight anymore. But what if the margin of victory is very narrow? Because you see, I show you the polls, right? They're predicting a very close fight. So that is the most worrying outcome, whereby he loses a little bit, but he thinks that he won, or by popular votes he won, and then go for another round of what he did in 2020. This time, maybe more serious, on a grander scale, on a bigger scale. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what will happen. I don't think that the chances of a serious, not just political, but a political, social, or even militant conflict within America is still breaking out. I think the chances of that are not low. And the signs are pointing in that direction. So a lot depends on what the results will be in November 2024. Right? So if you can see, other people are warning. This is another American Democrat politician. She is warning that the Trump supporters are getting ready for civil war should he lose the 2024 election. Now, if he loses by a huge margin, which based on the poll seems unlikely, if he loses by a huge margin, would he be gentlemanly enough to accept it and say, yeah, I really lose it this time? Or will he fight again? Who knows? I don't think he knows himself, right? And if you look at overseas media, this is the Sydney Morning Herald, where they say that Trump's re-election could lead to civil war in the United States. This was only very recently. So I think investors, people who invest in the NASDAQ, in the S&P 500, they always take political stability in America for granted. You know, when they invest in countries like Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, they're worried, oh, you know, you might have political rise, political uncertainty. Oh, you know, in America it's okay. We always have smooth transition and so on and so forth. I'm not so complacent, because so far America's history is very short. It's only 200 over years. America's history is not even as long as one single dynasty in China, the Han Dynasty, for example. So, as America progresses, America continues with its journey, there's going to be hiccups, major hiccups, small hiccups. Will this be one of them? And like I said, I think the assumption in almost all the investors in NASDAQ and NY is that, don't worry, political stability is a given. So, no, in life, you know, you find that things that you don't expect very often happens. Now, the other thing that is very crucial is the fact that America is a democracy. Now you may say, well, you know, democracy, things like that don't happen. I think you know that the truth is very different from there, right? Malaysia is a democracy, Thailand used to be a democracy, Philippines democracy, and so on and so forth. All kinds of quarrels, debates, and fighting break out in democracy. So let's take another look at another factor, the weaknesses of democracy. Let's turn to Jason Brennan. He is a professor at Georgetown University, political scientist, and he wrote a book called Against Democracy. He's not a believer in liberal democracy. He's definitely not a believer. And in his book, he explained to you in very good argument, convincing argument why democracy will not work, right? So he described that there are three types of voters in a democracy like America. He calls them hobbits, hooligans, and Vulcans. Now, before I show you the next slide, can you take a guess whether you are a hobbit, a hooligan, or a Vulcan? Take a guess, be honest, mark it yourself, right? And then maybe we'll do a survey after this video clip. Okay, let's see what's a hobbit. They are mostly apathetic, ignorant about politics, have no fixed opinions on most political issues. Hooligans, these are the rabid sport fan stuff of politics, like your Manchester United fan, like your Taylor Swift fan, you know, who can present arguments for what they believe in, but cannot explain or cannot accept alternative point of views, right? In a way that people with other views would be able to accept. Hooligans. The next one will be Vulcans. These are people, voters who can think scientifically and rationally about politics and opinions that are grounded in social sciences and philosophy. In other words, they are not ideological. If you present to them in a logical, rational manner that your democracy is wrong, they can accept it. Or that socialism is wrong, they can accept it and look for alternative. Now, what does Jason Brennan say about? He says most Americans are either hobbits or hooligans, or they fall somewhere in between. If I remember correctly, I think he says that about 5 to 10% of Americans are Vulcans. The majority will be in the hooligan category. And this is the type of people who would vote for Donald Trump, who probably will fight for him and probably will resort to other types of actions. So Jason Brennan says democracy does not deserve, you always say 3 cheers for democracy, right? Jason Brennan says democracy doesn't deserve at least 2 of the 3 cheers it gets. And Jason Brennan thinks that it does not even deserve to get the last cheer. When it comes to politics, most people know, some people know a lot. Most people know nothing. It's not just in America, it's the same in Malaysia as well. You can see how ignorant our voters are. And many people know less than nothing. I think what Jason Brennan described is applicable in every democracy in the world, including Singapore, including Britain, including Australia, and so on. So this is the last element in this very potent combination. Ordinary Americans and American politicians are in 2 separate worlds. It's in a democracy where a political system where there are so many weaknesses, a country that's got huge gun ownership, and you have a presidential election which has got a candidate whereby you have already seen how he behaved when he was president and how he behaved in the 2020 election, and no one knows how he's going to behave in November 2024. So with that, think about it. Give your comments. This is not pro-America, anti-America, nothing of that sort. I just want to, like I said, the YouTube channel of Capital Dynamics is a place where you come to and listen to angles, viewpoints that you probably cannot get anywhere else, right? Because we base it on a lot of research, a lot on analysis, and then come up with our own conclusions. The book by Jason Brennan, I've read it many years ago. The book by Barbara Walters, I've read it many years ago. So I'm not saying it out of any kind of ignorance. These are people, I'm not saying that they are always correct, but these are people who have done a lot of work and deserves our understanding and reading. So subscribe to our YouTube channel, like it, comment, and please share it or repost it or whatever it is. And more importantly, my last appeal to you all is please help those people who are so naive, because we've got a lot of naive voters, right? People who do not know anything or people who know less than nothing. And there are a lot of people out there who keep getting scammed by the impersonators of Teng Boo. So help these people and make this world a better place. So with that, I thank you again and see you again next week.